Joining me in the studio is someone who knows a lot about radicalisation. He's a counter-extremism expert in his own right, who formerly supported Hamas and has been de-radicalised, condemning the organisation. Sohail Ahmed joins me live in the studio. Well, I mean, OK, so first of all, how did you find yourself supporting or being part of Hamas?
Well, just to make clear from the get-go, I was never a member of Hamas,
right.
But I was an ardent supporter of Hamas, unfortunately. My radicalization journey, unfortunately, started at the mere age of 6. And that was as a result of my parents feeding me with the ideological poison of Islamism. I was taught to hate non-Muslims. I was taught that Britain is the enemy, that the West is the enemy, that there is a never-ending war between Muslims and non-Muslims, that violent jihad is an obligation on every Muslim. That's what I was raised with, and unfortunately, that's what I believed in. And kind of growing up, that kind of snowballed. And unfortunately, at a particular juncture, I even began considering violence.
Really? And you grew up in this country?
Yes, I was born in London.
In this country where they were radicalising you themselves, do you have any other brothers and sisters?
I do, and most of them are also radicalised. And I was also being radicalised by the mosque that I was attending.
Wow. And so, and that would take a form of, was that a mosque leader telling everybody, or
yes.
What was the form that
So
would...
essentially that would be during Friday sermons, during sermons outside of the Friday, usual sermons. That's the kind of form it took. I also kind of went online and kind of self-radicalized as well, kind of looking at fatwas that were written by Islamic scholars, usually from Saudi Arabia or elsewhere in the Middle East.
What is a fatwa?
A fatwa being a religious edict. Now, in the West, we know of fatwas as being kind of like death sentences or something like that. But a fatwa is essentially just a religious edict.
Okay. And I want to ask you then, how did you, because you're obviously not supporting Hamas now.
Absolutely not.
How did you get out of it? And what do your family still support them in the way that they made you support them?
I wouldn't be able to talk for my family at this stage because I've not spoken to them in 8 years since I left home. In terms of kind of the radicalization, it essentially, the way in which I got into and out of supporting Hamas was by understanding biological evolution. I was always kind of like the scientist. And when I understood that, I realized that this scientific theory contradicted some of my extremist beliefs. Not only that, I saw the rank hypocrisy amongst Islamists, amongst my fellow co-religionists of the Islamist persuasion. They were completely hypocritical. They would attack Hindus, they would attack Christians, they'd attack Jews and say the most horrible things about them. Yet when anyone would ever say anything slightly against Islam, even if it was a genuine criticism, they'd cry Islamophobia, and they basically say that individual's a bigot. There were other hypocrisies. For instance, they were against the US invading Iraq after 9/11. Yet, within the ideology, they believed that there should be total, complete world domination by military means.
See, when you see these marches and things, and Suella Braverman describing it as hate-filled, is she right in your view? And are the West being somewhat naive, calling for a ceasefire?
Partially, Suella Braverman is, in fact, correct. I'm assuming that not everyone in the march, because I did see some individuals wearing poppies. However, it may be a minority, but it was a very significant minority. A minority that was large enough to be very concerning for all of us. We saw openly, brazenly, not in this particular protest, but in the previous ones, people waving the black standard flag, which is a jihadist flag, screaming jihad, jihad, and saying bigoted things against non-Muslims. And there were calls for Muslim armies to come together and wipe Israel off the map. That I would kind of say to anyone who's not an Islamist who was a part of that protest or the protest today, I'd kind of advise or kind of caution and say, be very careful of who you get in bed with. Be very careful, because you absolutely have no idea who you're dealing with. I know who we're dealing with, because I used to be one of them. I used to attend pro-Palestine marches. And honestly, there was always a very significant Islamist, jihadist, extremist presence. And I don't say that lightly. It's honestly the truth. And I think everyone can see that.
And I think some people are trying to deny what they're seeing. I think a lot of people are trying to say, oh, it's all fair and soft and everything, but just because they're not violently protesting, I urge people to listen to what you're saying.
Yes.
Because you obviously understand the ideology and mindset of people who support this organisation, and obviously a lot of the underlying tensions within the pro-Palestine march. I want to ask you about the ceasefires now, because the West mostly are calling for ceasefires or pauses in the fighting. Is this a wise thing? Because obviously everyone cares about what's happening to the young people in Gaza and the people dying there. But the only reason it's not happening in Israel is because of the Iron Dome.
Indeed. It's incredibly sad what's happening in Gaza. It really is. Anyone who cares about human life is kind of going to feel something. But you have to realize that Israel is faced with two options. And they're both evil, in a sense. One is that you go after Hamas, degrade their capability, and try to neutralize them as far as possible. And in the process, civilian casualties occur and civilian mortalities happen. Or we let it go. Complete ceasefire. We let Hamas regrow, and the next attack will be much worse. Those are the two options we're left with. Now, when it comes to Israeli strategy and tactics, I may have criticisms of them in specific cases, but when it comes to a complete ceasefire, I am absolutely not in support of that. As for temporary ceasefires to allow humanitarian aid in, that I can support.
Well, listen, Sohail, I could talk to you for ages, and I will invite you back again, because I'd love you to be part of my panel at some point. We'll invite you in to discuss more, because this is going on, and it will go on for some time. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. Well, hopefully that was useful to a lot of you listening and watching, because Sohail Ahmed, he, of course, he was de-radicalised, and he condemns Hamas, and those are his views. What do you think?